I knew before I even stepped onto the marble-finished terrace that I shouldn't have come. The air itself felt curated. Floral arrangements more expensive than my rent were perched at every corner, their perfume mixing with the clinking of champagne flutes and the low hum of self-congratulation. My heels clicked on the stone path like they had something to prove, and I paused just before walking into the grand hall, adjusting the thin strap of my satin dress that was beautiful, but unmistakably off the rack. It wasn't shame I felt, not exactly. It was the familiar ache of being the wrong thread woven into a golden tapestry that never had room for texture like mine. The engagement party was for my cousin Elise, who was everything my family dreamed a woman could be. Slender, symmetrical, obedient in the way that didn't ruffle male egos. She had a laugh that floated like bubbles and a LinkedIn that read like a carefully edited rom-com. Georgetown undergrad, NYU Law, now engaged to Daniel freaking Morgan, the heir to Morgan Ventures. The kind of family that has wings in hospitals and buildings named after their grandmothers. I arrived solo. No fiancé on my arm. No story I was prepared to repeat. Just me, in a dress I wore once to a corporate gala, my fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute like it was an anchor. From the corner of the reception hall, I could see them, my parents, seated at the long mahogany table reserved for close family. They looked like they'd stepped straight out of a catalog, my mother in a pearl-colored blouse that shimmered under the chandelier light, my father in his custom-tailored navy suit. My mother was already mid-laugh, tossing her perfectly blow-dried hair back as she sipped her drink, nudging my father and pointing discreetly in my direction. She's always had a wild imagination, my mother said with a chuckle that I could hear clearly despite the ambient music. Her voice was light, but the edges were sharp enough to cut glass. Remember the French chef she swore she was dating in college? Now it's a billionaire from Dubai. Sure, sweetie. I stood frozen beside the champagne bar, my fingers tightening slightly around the glass, not enough to shatter it, but enough to feel it. The laughter around them spread like a slow ripple, reaching second cousins and old aunts who smiled too wide and nodded in agreement. I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. I raised my glass slightly in their direction and smiled, cool, unreadable. To the ones who never had to fake their love, cheers. They didn't hear it, of course. But someone standing next to me did. A man in a dark gray suit, younger than most of the men in the room, his face unreadable except for the flicker of something that passed through his eyes. Curiosity? Recognition? I didn't linger. I took a sip, let the champagne burn a little on its way down, and turned my attention to the massive portrait-sized photo of Elise and Daniel displayed near the cake table. They looked like an ad for genetically blessed bliss. The thing is, my parents weren't entirely wrong. There was no billionaire fiancé. There never had been. But there had been something. Or rather, someone. But not the kind of someone who gets introduced at family gatherings. Not someone you take selfies with under floral arches or who makes small talk with your uncle about mutual funds and vintage wine. He was the kind of someone you don't speak of until the moment is too late to undo. And tonight, I wasn't just nursing a bruised ego. I was nursing a plan. Because 3 months earlier, I had found something that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Something buried not in some dusty attic trunk, but in the silent way people avoid telling you the truth. That night, after the toast and the glimmer and the orchestrated speeches where Elise's perfection was celebrated like a civic holiday, I didn't slip away quietly. I made my rounds, kissed the right cheeks, smiled the way I was taught, and accepted compliments on my elegant simplicity, a phrase that always meant, "We see you're not rich, but you're trying, sweetie." It wasn't until I reached the private lounge reserved for immediate family that the energy shifted. "Darling," my mother said, her tone tightening like a corset the moment I stepped in, "you really should have RSVP'd with a +1. We always keep hoping this phantom fiancé of yours will finally materialize." I considered bringing someone, I said, setting down my drink on the marble countertop and locking eyes with her. But then I thought, why ruin a good surprise? That made her pause, but only for a second. My father glanced up from his scotch, already half bored. Elise, sitting with perfect posture in a silk jumpsuit now instead of her earlier gown, tilted her head like I was a child who'd said something cute but misguided. "Still writing fiction, are we?" she asked, her voice sweet, her intent bitter. "Maybe you should think about submitting to those podcast story shows. You always had a flair for drama." And there it was again, that low hum of dismissal, the undercurrent of condescension I'd learned to survive on. But this time I smiled, because I knew something they didn't. Something that made me more dangerous than they could imagine. I was no longer playing their game. I was building my own. The first piece of it had been slipped into a safety deposit box in Midtown 3 weeks ago. A small folder, thin but potent. Inside it were documents, real ones. Not forged, not imagined. The kind that make people very nervous when their names are attached. The kind of thing that would not only make people talk, but make them scramble to contain. And it all started with a letter I'd found, entirely by accident, while cleaning out my grandmother's attic after her funeral last fall. A letter addressed to my mother, never opened. Postmarked from a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York. From a woman named Margaret Hale. The name meant nothing to me at the time. But the handwriting was delicate, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. And the more I read, the more I began to understand that this woman was not a stranger. She was my birth mother. That's the part my family never told me. Not in childhood. Not in adolescence. Not even during the long years of therapy they insisted I needed after I started asking too many questions. Margaret was a whistleblower. A psychiatrist who had once tried to expose unethical practices at a clinic that no longer exists, publicly closed down after a series of vague lawsuits and confidential settlements. And the man she tried to expose? Dr. Richard Halverson. The same name engraved in brass on the wing of the hospital my father had helped fund through years of anonymous donations. It was all there in black and white. Newspaper clippings, a birth certificate with my name and hers. A full medical file, sealed but barely hidden, marked confidential. She had tried to protect me. And my adoptive parents had helped bury her. And now, they wanted to laugh about fake fiancés? No. This wasn't about making a scene at a party. This wasn't about proving myself in front of relatives who still called me that artsy one. This was about making them see. Making them remember. Making them regret. I reached for my clutch, pulled out my phone, and opened the encrypted email draft I'd prepared. Not sent. Not yet. But ready. It contained one file. Titled simply, Margaret's Legacy. As I walked back out onto the terrace, Elisa's voice floated behind me, something about a Paris honeymoon and a penthouse view. I ignored it. I walked straight to the edge of the balcony, let the cool evening wind sweep over my skin, and looked out over the ocean of chandeliers, glittering dresses, and champagne-slick smiles. I was no longer the girl they laughed about behind napkins. I was the storm they never saw coming. I stood at the edge of the party, the softest curve of a smile playing on my lips like the echo of a secret only I knew. Champagne still sat in my hand, now slightly warmer, the bubbles lazy and fading like every thin pretense in this room once my truth carved its way into the light. The terrace buzzed again, whispers crackling like dry leaves underfoot, as if my silence had finally made too much noise. "She's toasting alone again?" A woman in a mint green dress murmured, her voice a poor attempt at a whisper. Poor girl. Still clinging to fantasy. I heard them all, every word. And I didn't flinch. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared enough not to break my silence too soon. Across the party, eyes glanced my way, flitting like moths toward the dimmer flame, the one they assumed would burn out before the evening ended. I could see pity crawling up their throats, could feel the smugness radiating from their glances. These were not strangers. They were relatives, family friends, people who once called me bright, potential-filled, destined for something. Now, they just called me the girl who couldn't let go of her stories. But what they didn't know, and what I was about to let them see, was that the story they'd mocked all night wasn't one I imagined. It was real, powerful, and carefully protected. And the only reason they hadn't seen it before was because I'd chosen, again and again, not to hand my life to a room that only knew how to judge with the weight of their own insecurity. What they didn't know was that I was engaged. Truly, privately, fiercely engaged to someone who never needed to prove anything to a room full of people who measured worth in suits and surnames. I hadn't invented a partner to soothe my ego. I had simply refused to reduce him to a bullet point in someone else's dinner gossip. We met 2 years ago in the golden dust of a Moroccan sunrise, on the edge of a humanitarian project so underfunded we often shared bottled water like it was currency. I'd volunteered during my sabbatical, chasing a cause more than a plan, and he had appeared like a contradiction, American-born, British-educated, quiet but undeniable. He was there to audit the project's sustainability, and while everyone mistook him for an aloof observer, I saw the way he listened before speaking, how he noticed the girl who only spoke broken French, but still brought tea to every worker without being asked. We had our first real conversation while crouched next to a broken irrigation pipe, hands muddy, cheeks red from the unforgiving sun. He told me his name, Noah Bennett, and I told him mine. He asked why I was really there, and I said, because something inside me couldn't stay quiet anymore. He didn't laugh. He just nodded, like he understood that sometimes the loudest transformations begin in silence. We shared more in that week than I'd shared with people I'd known for years. And when we left Morocco, he didn't ask for a casual goodbye or some vague promise of staying in touch. Instead, he handed me a note, just one line scribbled in his tidy handwriting. This is not where our story ends. And it didn't. Encrypted emails followed. Long ones, late ones. Love, coded and cloaked, poured between two people who never wanted their intimacy to become spectacle. We never posted each other online. We never added hearts to stories. We built something in the space between noise, a quiet cathedral made of shared memory and absolute trust. Our engagement happened on a rooftop in Seoul, just after midnight. The wind had pulled my hair loose, and he'd brushed it behind my ear before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a ring I hadn't expected, even though I'd already said yes 100 different ways in 100 different moments. No cameras. No audience. Just the city below and the sky above. I agreed to keep our relationship private, not out of shame but out of preservation. He wasn't a man who needed to be seen to be believed. He moved in the shadows between wealth and influence, operating discreetly, investing in solutions instead of attention. His world didn't belong to the ones who clapped loudest. It belonged to the ones who made the quiet count. And that included me. Until tonight. Tonight, I'd decided that hiding had served its purpose. Tonight, I would no longer trade peace for invisibility. Because when I stood there and heard my mother chuckle about my so-called fantasy fiancé, and when I saw my father smirk without even bothering to make it subtle, something inside me settled into place. I was done allowing other people's inability to believe in depth to convince me to remain small. The final push came during the toast. Daniel Morgan, the golden boy of the evening, fiancé to my cousin Elise, stood at the center of the room, microphone in hand, his voice the polished echo of 1,000 country club lessons and weekend debates practiced in marble halls. I just want to say, he began, his tone dripping with just the right amount of modesty, that Elise and I have built something real. Not something imagined or exaggerated for attention. A soft chuckle from the crowd. A few people glanced my way. He continued. Because you see, in a world where some people have to pretend to be loved, where fiction replaces fact, it's important to celebrate relationships that are actually mutual. That was it. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. And worse, they agreed. My parents clapped. Elise beamed like she'd just been handed another crown. And the party, the one I had smiled through for nearly 2 hours, tilted on its axis. Then, the air shifted. It began as a sound, barely audible at first. A low hum, like the murmuring of distant thunder, soft enough to mistake for imagination. But it grew. People began to pause mid-laugh. Forks froze above plates. Heads turned toward the sky. The humming deepened, steady, measured, deliberate. Glasses on the tables began to tremble slightly, the water inside them dancing in quiet panic. Someone gasped. A waiter dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres. For a split second, it was chaos. "Is it security?" someone asked. "An emergency?" another whispered. But I knew. I turned to face the sky as the helicopter came into view, sleek, black, and unfamiliar to every person in the room except me. It hovered just above the terrace, kicking up wind and tension, casting a shadow that stretched across the polished tiles like an omen. The letters on the side gleamed against the night, Bennett International Foundation. It hovered for 5 seconds. Then, just as quickly, it began to descend toward the edge of the estate, settling into the helipad none of the guests even knew existed until now. Staff scrambled. Guests leaned forward in awe and confusion. And I stood perfectly still. Because what they didn't realize, what made this moment a masterpiece instead of mere spectacle, was that the very party they were standing in, the flowers they photographed, the chandeliers they admired, and the champagne they toasted with had all been paid for by him. By Noah, anonymously. 3 months ago, when Elise's engagement was first announced, he'd asked me quietly, gently, what I needed from him. And I told him, nothing. Not then. But a week later, he showed me the ledger. Every invoice. Every venue deposit. Every flower vendor. Every catering service. Paid in full by a shell company under Bennett International. No one questioned it. Wealth doesn't get interrogated in my family. They saw the opulence, assumed it came from Daniel's side, and clapped louder. I asked Noah why he did it. His answer was simple. So they'll know the story they mocked was always bigger than their small imagination. And now he was here. As the helicopter door opened, I saw him step out composed, elegant, without theatrics. He didn't wave. He didn't rush. He simply walked forward with the kind of presence that didn't require noise. The kind of presence that silences a crowd simply by being undeniable. Gasps followed him like shadows. Some guests stumbled back. Elise dropped her champagne glass, and the sound of it shattering cut through the terrace like a scream. Daniel blinked, confused, his hand gripping the microphone he'd just used to insult me with surgical precision. My parents stood, mouths slightly parted, eyes darting from Noah to me and back again. And then Noah's gaze met mine. The world slowed. He walked straight toward me, not once breaking stride. And when he reached me, he didn't pause for permission. He took my hand, pulled me gently forward, and kissed me tender, certain, real. The silence that followed was deeper than any applause could have been. And then, softly, he turned to the crowd and spoke. I apologize for the interruption, he said, his voice calm and unshakable. But I realized I'd grown tired of hearing lies told about the woman I love. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd again. I'm Noah Bennett, he continued, his words precise and weighted, and I've been engaged to her for almost a year. Some of you believed she was lying. Some of you laughed. And that's fine. You didn't need to believe her. She didn't need your belief. Because everything she is, everything she's built, everything you tried to belittle, stands taller than this entire estate. He turned back to me, his hand tightening around mine. Are you ready? He asked. I nodded. And together, we walked away, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in the kind of grace that only comes when truth finally walks out into the open and looks contempt straight in the face. As we reached the edge of the terrace, I turned briefly to look at my parents. My mother's expression was frozen in a kind of stunned horror. My father's jaw twitched, but he didn't speak. Elise stood there pale, her hand clenching Daniel's arm as if that could stop the blood from draining from her perfect cheeks. I didn't need to say a word, because they'd already heard everything, and I had so much more left to show them. There are moments when time doesn't slow down, it stops. Not in some poetic, breathless way that artists paint onto pages, but in the brutal, surgical manner that slices through a crowd and forces every heartbeat to reckon with itself. That was the moment we stood in. Outside, the sleek black helicopter still stirred the air like a whispered threat, its blades gradually grinding to a halt, as if time itself had yielded to the presence of the man who stepped from it. Inside the estate, everything, the chatter, the orchestra, the careful small talk, the flow of champagne, had simply ceased to exist. Even the music had gone quiet, as if the sound system understood it had lost its audience. Everyone had rushed toward the windows, their designer shoes clicking against the marble like a frightened stampede that hadn't decided whether to gawk or run. I didn't turn to join them. I didn't need to. I already knew what they were seeing. He stepped out of the helicopter the way kings probably stepped onto battlefields, deliberately, calmly, with the kind of authority that made the air itself behave differently. His suit was navy, impossibly tailored, moving like skin over his frame, with every detail crisp enough to cut through doubt. He adjusted his watch as if that alone demanded attention, then turned toward the estate, walking with no haste, but with purpose so sharp it left an invisible trail in his wake. Then the door swung open. Not the helicopter's, ours. He entered the hall like it belonged to him. Not through arrogance. Not through ego. But through an unwavering sense of self so intact, it rearranged the emotional architecture of every person in the room. "Sorry I'm late," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to push through the thick tension. "Had to park the helicopter. The Dubai flight was delayed." Silence fell so deeply it bordered on reverence. I didn't need to look at my mother to know her champagne flute had slipped through her fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound had cracked through the hush like a confession. My father stood frozen, blinking slowly, the kind of blink that spoke of rewiring, as if he were rebooting his brain in real time, unable to process what had just unfolded before him. Elise stared like a porcelain doll that had seen a ghost, one hand clutching the edge of the table as if the room might tilt at any moment and send her spiraling off the planet. He walked through the hall like he already knew every exit, every window, every inch of marble beneath his shoes. Then he stopped in front of me, and before a single breath could ruin the moment, he reached for my hand. He didn't ask for permission. He never had to. He kissed my fingers first, lightly, reverently, then leaned in, brushing his lips against my cheek in a gesture so intimate, so practiced, that no one in the room could possibly believe it was the first time. "Did I miss the part where they doubted you again?" he asked, his voice a murmur meant only for me, but loud enough for the silence to carry it. I smiled, not the smile they were used to, not the polite, vacant curve I used to wear to survive their scrutiny, but the real one. The one that held decades of silence, defiance, and a promise delivered. "No," I said, my voice steady, loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to make them lean in. "You're just in time." The ripple effect was instant. Gasps fell from mouths like pearls from broken necklaces. A few older relatives sat back down in their chairs, as if the weight of the moment had become too much to bear standing. The orchestra began to play again, softly, hesitantly, unsure whether it had permission to fill the void. It didn't matter. Nothing could compete with what was unfolding. He turned to the crowd without theatrics, but with a presence so large it collapsed every doubt that had been muttered in corners earlier that night. "My name is Noah Bennett," he said, finally introducing himself to the room that had spent so long denying his existence. "And yes, I'm the man you've all dismissed, denied, and decided couldn't possibly be real. I understand. It's easier to believe a woman lies than that she lives a life bigger than your imagination." There was no applause, just breath. Painful, uneven, gasping breath from people who had built entire narratives around my supposed desperation. "I've been engaged to this woman," he continued, his hand gently resting against the small of my back, "for nearly a year. We chose privacy not because we were ashamed, but because our love didn't need validation from a room that gossips louder than it listens." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word felt like an incision. Tonight, I came because I was done watching you reduce her to fiction. She's not fiction. She's the most honest, brilliant, unshakable woman I've ever known. And the only fantasy here was believing you were ever worthy of judging her. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of regret, of shame, of people internally clawing at their assumptions. It filled every crack in the marble floors. It settled into the spaces between champagne flutes. It pressed down on shoulders dressed in silk and arrogance. I looked at my mother then. Really looked at her. She stood with her lips parted, her eyes wide and wet not from beauty but from the collapse of control. For years, she had crafted a version of me that suited her narrative, troubled, eccentric, always on the edge of something fragile. She had mocked my dreams, minimized my achievements, and taken every opportunity to reinforce her belief that I was the family embarrassment wrapped in delusion. And now? She stood like a statue in a museum of her own failure. My father was worse. He still hadn't moved, as if disbelief had welded him to the floor. His mouth opened briefly, as if to speak, but then closed again, nothing coming out but the sound of a man who had just watched the foundation of his superiority crack wide open. Elise didn't speak either. She didn't have to. The betrayal was carved into every inch of her face. She had always prided herself on being the jewel of the family, the benchmark no one else could reach. But tonight, the mirror she had built her identity around had shattered. And in its place stood something she couldn't control, a woman who hadn't needed to outshine her to eclipse her completely. And Daniel? The man who had weaponized his speech like a scalpel earlier? He had the decency to look ashamed. Not enough to apologize, but enough to stare at the ground, jaw clenched, hands folded, the microphone now sitting idle on the table like a prop in a show he no longer owned. I looked back at Noah. He didn't smile. Because this wasn't a victory to gloat about. It was a reckoning. And it wasn't over. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a small, black envelope, and handed it to me. I opened it without hesitation. Inside was a single folded page. I knew what it was. The deed to the estate. The very one we were standing in. Purchased 6 weeks ago through a silent bid from one of his foundations. My uncle had sold it without fanfare, too eager to cover gambling debts to question the source. The event space we were standing in, the grand estate Elise had once claimed was our family jewel, was now mine. And it was time they knew. I'd like to make a toast, I said, finally raising my glass again. This time, my voice didn't tremble. This time, I wasn't toasting alone. Everyone turned. Not because they were interested. Because they were afraid not to. To truth, I said. To the people who spend years surviving laughter they didn't deserve. To those who loved quietly while others judged loudly. To those who were doubted, dismissed, and still showed up with grace. And to the ones who assumed they understood everything, may they finally learn that real love doesn't require an audience, but it will burn through silence when it must. I turned to Noah. He lifted his glass, his eyes never leaving mine. And to the ones, I added, voice sharp, who never needed to prove anything, but did, just to remind the world what real power looks like. We clinked glasses. And drank. The room, frozen for what felt like hours, began to unthaw. People turned back to their tables, unsure of whether to clap or apologize or disappear altogether. Some walked out. Some stayed seated. But no one looked at me the same way again. Because I was no longer a story they could laugh at. I was the one they would remember. For most of my life, I believed that silence was a survival tactic. A shield you carried when your voice wasn't welcome, when your truths were inconvenient, when your dreams didn't fit neatly into the glass cases others had prepared for you. But in that room, standing beside a man the world didn't know I loved, and now could never forget, I realized something even more powerful. Silence, when used with precision, isn't a retreat. It's a weapon. And I had spent years learning how to wield it perfectly. The mood in the hall changed like a curtain being torn from a window. The air that had once been thick with dismissal and smug mockery now trembled with revelation, confusion, and the frantic need to realign. People began to move again, awkwardly at first, like their feet didn't quite know how to walk in a world that no longer followed their rules. Guests who had whispered behind champagne glasses and fake sympathy now made their way forward, their faces painted in the kind of smiles that only appear when someone is desperate to pretend they've always been on your side. One by one, they approached Noah, some too eagerly, others with the strained dignity of people forced to acknowledge a king they had mocked in disguise. An older man with a gray pocket square leaned in, offering a handshake with trembling fingers. I didn't realize you were connected to the Morgans. Small world, isn't it? Noah simply smiled. That kind of smile that said, no, it's not small. You're just used to living in a shallow corner of it. Then came my parents. My mother walked with a half-step hesitation, the movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but I'd watched her rehearse confidence in mirrors for decades. She reached us with eyes wide, glassy not from tears but from the disintegration of a story she'd spent years constructing, one where I was always trailing, always lacking, always just a little too much or not enough. Honey, she said, and I could hear the crack in her voice like something precious finally fracturing. You should have told us. I didn't blink. I didn't soften. No, I replied, voice firm and unshaking. You should have listened when I tried. My father stood beside her, still visibly stunned, as if his years of spreadsheet logic couldn't make room for the emotional math unfolding before him. We didn't know, he said, his voice trailing off like a signal fading into static. He's Bennett International. We had no idea. That was the point. Because for them, respect had always been transactional. Their love had always required a resume. And now that they recognized Noah from the business circles they idolized, the investment reports, the Forbes features, the boardroom rumors about the man who funded solutions behind the scenes, they didn't see a fairy tale anymore. They saw a power move. And that made them panic. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't perform grace. I simply let them stand in their discomfort and feel every inch of it, the way I had felt every dismissive nod, every patronizing laugh, every backhanded compliment about my imagination. Elise didn't say a word. Not because she lacked the vocabulary, but because the very foundation of her identity had cracked beneath her heels. She had built her image on being the crown jewel, the family's flawless heir, the one who never stumbled in public or failed in private. But the man standing beside me, the one who kissed my hand like it was sacred and held my truth like it was armor, was someone she recognized. And not just as a guest. Not just as a surprise. Her fiancé recognized him too. Daniel's face had gone pale, and his usual self-assurance hung around his shoulders like a jacket 2 sizes too big. He stared at Noah like a man who'd seen a ghost from a boardroom he couldn't enter, like someone who had once laughed at the silent investor in the room, only to realize that the man now kissing my cheek was the one who had quietly outbid him on more than one project. He stepped forward, his words thin and cautious. You're Bennett. I didn't know. Noah turned toward him slowly, with that unbothered calm that made men like Daniel sweat through their tailored collars. You didn't need to know, he said, voice low but crisp. Some people only see value when it's printed on a balance sheet. Others? They just know. Daniel nodded stiffly, unsure whether to offer a handshake or bow or disappear. I could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his ego scrambled for recovery. But there was no recovery left. This wasn't his stage anymore. We didn't wait for applause. Noah and I walked past them all, hand in hand, not in triumph, but in truth. The kind of truth that doesn't require forgiveness to feel complete. And just before we reached the door, just before the final click of my heels would mark the end of their old world, I turned back. Not to beg, not to gloat, but to deliver the one final line I had carried with me since the moment this evening began. I turned toward Elise and Daniel, whose smiles had faded into a stunned silence that clung to their skin like regret. "Oh," I said, my voice light but undeniable, before I forget. Everyone leaned in. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. "This engagement party?" I continued, blinking slowly, my smile as soft as velvet and sharp as broken glass. "He paid for it." Quietly. Every flower. Every bottle. Every crystal-draped lie. There were gasps. Actual gasps. You'd think someone had passed out. But I wasn't finished. I let my gaze drift toward the lavishly designed gift table, the one piled high with registry boxes Elise had hand-selected from stores she had never even entered herself. "So your registry?" I added, almost as an afterthought. "You're welcome." And then I smiled. Not the smile of someone who'd won. The smile of someone who had nothing left to prove. We stepped into the night air, leaving behind the echo of stunned faces and shattered illusions, the weight of their expectations collapsing beneath the truth they had never imagined would arrive in a helicopter and a tailored Navy suit. Outside, the breeze wrapped around us like a seal of freedom, crisp and alive, untouched by the room we'd just left behind. We didn't speak right away. We didn't need to, because every step forward was a sentence in the story I was finally allowed to write out loud. As we reached the car, Noah paused and turned toward me, his hand never letting go of mine. "Are you ready?" he asked. I looked at him, not the way I used to look at people, searching for permission or reassurance, but the way people look at their own reflection after walking through fire and realizing they survived not by accident, but by choice. "I've been ready," I said. "I just needed them to see what I always knew." He nodded, and we slid into the back seat of the car that waited, engine humming softly like the start of a new chapter. The estate behind us grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the story didn't shrink. It expanded, filled every space they once tried to trap me in. I had been the girl they underestimated, the woman they doubted, the daughter they forgot. But I became the storm they couldn't stop, and now I wasn't going to hide anymore. The screen fades out on my smile, not rage, not revenge, just a quiet certainty built from years of silence that no longer needed explanation. Because the world always remembers the noise. But what they never expect, what they never see coming, is the storm that arrives without thunder. They laughed when they thought I was lying. But some stories are too big to tell until the sky brings them in. Subscribe for more stories where silence isn't a weakness, it's just the calm before impact.